Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Shortcut U podcast. This time I sit down with Dr. Nicolas Verhoeven, who recently earned his Ph.D. in molecular medicine and cell and molecular physiology. He also has a Master's of Science degree in exercise physiology and has taught nutrition as a professor of physiology and also has been doing cell and molecular biology research for over 10 years. He's been putting out content for the lay public on his Physionic platform since 2014, where he, in his own words, helps you learn your body from the macro to the micro. I really enjoyed our conversation. We covered things across a broad spectrum of health and fitness topics, ranging from GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs like Ozempic and how they might be helpful for weight loss, how exercise impacts your health, and all the way to things like how to navigate health and fitness content on social media. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Nicolas Verhoeven. So the first thing I was thinking about talking about is mechanisms, since you're kind of a mechanism guy. But I also see you talking all the time about actual human trials and things like that, and fitting everything into the typical research hierarchy of valuing different studies differently. And one thing I'm curious to hear your opinions about are like how a lot of content about mechanisms are serving kind of lay people that aren't really doing research or doing a lot of science. For example, I think you're familiar with Lane Norton. He always talks about human randomized controlled trials in his doom voice when he's kind of critiquing people in his What the Fitness videos, because it's really easy for people to get caught up hearing about hormones. And I'm certainly guilty of this as much as anybody else. When I first got into health and fitness stuff a lot, if you asked me, or if you showed me a video of my conversation 4 years ago, I'd be super embarrassed right now, because I'd be talking about I would be completely bought into the insulin carbohydrate model of obesity, which I'm sure we can talk about, and stuff like that. I just think it's, especially even for people who are biology majors or some type of science major in college, I feel like as one of those people, I was a health science major, but I took pre-med coursework, so all of the hard sciences. I feel like I was super vulnerable to this because I could actually understand some of the mechanisms, and this is what I was learning in school. So it was just so simple to go and apply that directly without, taking a look at actual outcomes in humans. And anyway, I'll leave the floor to you with any of your thoughts on any of this stuff I just said.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great topic. Looking at mechanisms compared to looking at human trials or clinical trials in general. And it's true that a lot of people get caught up in the mechanisms. And you mentioned Lane Norton. There's one analogy that I really like that he uses quite frequently, which is this index fund analogy. I don't know if you've run across that one already.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a perfect illustration of how we should be thinking about science in general, or I guess more specifically on mechanisms and clinical work. I think the hierarchy that has been established for quite some time now of looking at meta-analyses, which are multiple randomized control trials. It doesn't have to be RCTs, doesn't have to be these human trials, but it typically is these human trials. So you have this grouping of many different studies all into one paper, into one meta-analysis, one major paper, which is the top tier. And there's certain, nuances that come along with that too. But then, under that, you've got the single studies that are these human randomized controlled trials. And then from there, you go into basically associative studies that can still be about humans, but they're just not these intervention trials, essentially, like the human randomized controlled trials that Lane likes to shout about, which I certainly understand. And then you get into more of the mechanistic research. That's when you can, we've already discussed now 3 different layers that have higher priority than the mechanism research. And the mechanism research is where all the fun is. I mean, that's where you really get to nerd out. I mean, it's cool if you can say, oh, this leads to a certain amount of fat loss. That's interesting and that's applicable. That's very informative, but it's not fun When you're talking in biology, or you're talking about nerding out about something, you want to nerd out about exactly how does it do that. Well, that's where the mechanisms come in, and that's why there is that hierarchy of assessing what is the actual functional outcome, what actually happens, and then we go backwards and figure out what the mechanisms are. Not we figure out the mechanisms and then we try to fit that to some narrative that we want. And even if it doesn't fit with the human trial. So uh, it seems to be often very backwards in social media, but scientists have it the opposite way, and it's not as sexy, but it's definitely the correct way to go about things.
And what drew you to like really being interested in that mechanistic type of stuff? Because it seems like, um, although you just described it as maybe not being like as sexy of an approach, that's really like where you like to live, is down in those like cellular mechanisms and stuff. And then maybe, I mean, I'm familiar a little bit with your background, which is kind of interesting because you started off as a psychology major, I think, in undergrad, and then switched to exercise science for your master's, and then now something even a little bit different for your PhD. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit about kind of that path and what makes you tick with all that.
Yeah, I did psychology for my undergrad, which was a big mistake. It's kind of in that stage where you're learning what you actually enjoy. And you said that you were interested in health science and pre-med and whatnot. So I wish that I had been at that stage from the very beginning, but I wasn't. I was in psychology. So ended up discovering, it was during my psychology degree that I realized that I care so much about understanding how the body functions, the actual physiology, which is not what psychology is about. So ended up going back to school and studied nutrition science and exercise physiology as an undergrad to essentially earn my way into a master's program. And then I earned my way after about a year and a half of classes to get into a master's program for exercise physiology. So that now I was starting to get into that realm of physiology and understanding metabolism and all that stuff, which was fascinating. But the other aspect then is I'm 6'6", I weigh about 220, and I'm a pretty big person, and I've been lifting weights for a very long time. And the first thing that people think when they think of me, when they see me, is what kind of workouts do you do? What kind of nutrition do you have? Which I don't mind, but I'm actually far more interested in beyond exercise. So me pigeonholing myself into exercise physiology, even as a master's, just wasn't going to do it for me. So that's why, as you pointed out, my degree for my PhD was quite a bit different. It was a lot broader. It's medicine. So it's called molecular medicine, but the concentration, if you want to call it that, is cell physiology. So essentially, I have to learn about everything related to physiology. Not that I know everything about physiology, just to be clear, but yeah. So it was kind of that evolution that ultimately led me to where I am now.
Gotcha. Cool. Let's talk about a little science then.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on GLP-1 receptor agonists? Pretty hot topic. I've seen you put out some content about it, and I'll leave it open to you to kind of take it where you wish, and then we'll see. I have a little bit of knowledge of like some research on specific things about the topic that I can maybe contribute, but I'll see what you have to think about it, or say about it rather.
Sure. Yeah. GLP-1 receptor agonists. I guess to give a brief background on that, your body produces, as you were talking about actually very early on, about hormones and whatnot. Your body produces all kinds of different hormones. One of those hormones that your body produces is this hormone called glucagon-like peptide. And that is a hormone that's released primarily by some cells in your intestines called the L cells. So these L cells will be activated. They get activated by the sensation of food. So if like food stuff enters the cell, then the cell has a bunch of receptors that ultimately recognize, okay, there's been a shift in the metabolic environment of the cell, which ultimately leads to gene expression for these genes that encode, have the information for the GLP-1 glucagon-like peptide 1 information. So the information for the production of this protein. And those genes get read, and then they get produced into a protein. Now you have the GLP-1 protein, and that gets ejected out of the backside of the cell. So because if you're talking about your intestines, you have kind of a front side, which is facing the actual intestinal wall. And then you have a backside, which is facing the blood side of obviously everything that moves from your intestines has to go from the inside of your intestines into your bloodstream. And glucagon-like peptide gets ejected out of the backside into the bloodstream. And then from there, it circulates through your bloodstream, and it has profound effects on your pancreas, for example. It can allow for greater release of insulin, which helps diabetics. The other thing that it does is that it can bind to your brain, and it changes your general drive to eat. And the way that it does that for your pancreas or for your brain, it binds to particular receptors on your brain. If you were to zoom in to your brain, there's a section of your brain called the hypothalamus, which controls a lot of your feeding behavior and a lot of your just general behavior overall. And inside that hypothalamus are a grouping of cells. There's the POMC neurons, so neurons being brain cells, POMC, POMC, and then you have these AGRP, NPY neurons, which is another grouping of cells. And they're very antithetic to one another in that these POMC neurons tend to downregulate hunger, and the AGRP, NPY neurons tend to increase hunger if they're become more active. So GLP-1 will bind to both sets of these neurons and decrease the activity of AGRP and NPY neurons, and will increase the activity of POMC neurons. And there's a lot of cross communication between these two groups of neurons. And the ultimate end result is that you end up consuming less. And it also has effects on your stomach and things like that, but I don't want to go too much into the mechanisms. That's the general idea of how GLP-1 works inside the body. And what these drugs do is that they mimic GLP-1, but they mimic GLP-1 in such a way that what chemists have done is that they've taken this protein, this GLP-1 protein, and slightly altered the chemical structure of it so that it is less likely to be degraded. So we don't have to just worry about the production of a protein. We also have to worry about the degradation of that protein, because if it gets produced and immediately gets degraded, then it's basically a futile cycle. It just gets produced and degraded, produced and degraded. So what researchers have done is they've slightly altered the structure of the protein so that when it gets produced, or I guess I should say in this case, because it's not coming from your genes, it's an actual injection. So you inject it into your bloodstream, and this slightly altered protein, then it can't be degraded nearly as easily. It can still be degraded, but it's just degraded at a far, far slower rate. So typically GLP-1 is degraded by a protein called DPP-4. And when that protein tries to interact with this particular synthetic version of GLP-1, it tries and it can't degrade it into, essentially break it down into nothingness. So this GLP-1 receptor agonist will float around in the bloodstream for as much as a week, sometimes more, and will continue to interact with all these receptors and will continue to modulate the brain, this specific area of the brain called the hypothalamus, and continue to affect the pancreas in such a way that it accentuates all the positive effects of GLP-1, the GLP-1 that we produce in our body. So with diabetes, it'll increase secretion of insulin and thereby decrease blood sugar. Because it has such a potent effect on our food consumption habits, it dramatically reduces our food consumption, which then ultimately leads to significant weight loss, significant fat loss, which then translates to any number of different outcomes. If that's reduced, you could, I don't want to say cure, but it can certainly significantly help treat diabetes. It helps against cardiovascular disease. It helps against cancer. It helps against all the major diseases it helps against. And the side effects of this particular drug class are pretty mild up to now that we know of. That may change as we get more and more data. And of course, we're getting tons of data because so many people are starting to use them. But the side effects tend to be like nausea, vomiting, headache, things like that, which I know obviously don't sound exactly very appetizing, but it's not like it's causing cancer or something like that, which would be disastrous. There's some discussion on potential muscle loss, but from the literature that I've looked at, which I looked at a bunch of meta-analyses that we just talked about, and those didn't indicate anything related to muscle mass. To be clear, they didn't actually measure it, so I can't say, oh, there's no effect on muscle. It's just that they didn't measure it. So anecdotally, there's some complaints that people can lose muscle mass, especially when they go from a very high weight and end up dropping a ton of weight. They may lose some muscle mass, but I think that kind of stuff can be mitigated by simply just resistance training a little bit more, consuming a little bit more protein, which should be things that you're already doing. So if you're adding this kind of therapy to your life when you're already trying to make some small changes to your life, I think it's probably going to have mostly an additive benefit. And there's going to be the few exceptions where it just has disastrous consequences. And of course, that's honestly always the case. That's if you hop on a low carb diet or a vegan diet or whatever diet you end up doing, whatever intervention you end up doing, you're always going to have a few people that have really bad reactions. And that's it's just the nature of how science works. You talk about averages, you talk about the population. It's going to affect 95% of people this way. We can predict that, but there's going to be a small percentage of people that are just going to have adverse effects. So that's my spiel on GLP-1 receptor agonists.
Gotcha. Yeah, most of the research that I've read regarding this topic has to do with the muscle mass stuff you were talking about. I haven't read a ton of the actual papers on the weight loss. I've heard everyone talking about it, and I've seen anecdotes, and I figure everyone's talking about how amazing they are for weight loss and how they, blow everything else out of the water. So I'll take their word for that for now until I get to the point where I have more time I allocate more time to reading about it. But for the muscle mass stuff, I thought it was interesting because the first kind of baseline response I've seen people come out with who are kind of knowledgeable in the health and fitness or scientific realm, if you will, is that with regular weight loss, there's significant losses in muscle mass, typically if the individuals are not resistance training or maintaining a high protein diet. And I looked into that, and there are some pretty shocking results, I guess, for people who value muscle mass, which I think most people who are concerned with health or longevity probably will at this point. I think rightfully, there's been a lot of talk about muscle mass and strength and exercise that's come out in recent years. As far as I've seen, I feel like nutrition and sleep maybe were valued more, at least what I've seen in social media up until more recent years. But anyway, a couple of interesting things I found or kind of conclusions I've come to so far. I don't know how much more I'll keep digging through this hole on weight loss and muscle mass losses. The first is that some proportion of adipose tissue is water. And so a lot of these studies will look at fat-free mass or lean body mass. Some of them, I think kind of a smaller proportion based on what I've seen, will actually use CT or MRI, the way that they do in real exercise science related papers looking at muscle hypertrophy and stuff. But a lot of the papers just look at fat-free mass and lean body mass. And even if we had exclusively lost fat mass via a given weight loss protocol, you would expect to see some decreases in lean body mass or fat-free mass, I think, because some of that adipose tissue would be water. And another really interesting thing I came across, particularly when it comes to obese individuals, is that it was something called muscle attenuation, which I'd never heard about before, which is pretty much a measure of, it looks at the different densities of muscle mass via MRI scans. And it's kind of a measure of the quality of the muscle mass based on the fat content within the muscle tissue. And I've only seen one study but all the studies I've looked at that look at muscle attenuation are maybe like 20 years old or something. I haven't seen it talked about much otherwise. But really, the gist is that that kind of lower quality muscle mass that has higher fat content is lower quality. And when you look at strength outcomes or measures of strength, at least in one paper that I saw, it matched with pretty much the lower quality muscle mass not producing as much force or as much strength. And you want pretty much the higher quality muscle mass, just like it would sound, is better. But anyway, my point is that there was a paper I read where the decreases in muscle mass as measured by, it was either MRI or CT, were largely this lower quality muscle mass in, I don't know exactly if it was overweight. I think it was obese subjects. But anyway, that was just another interesting nuance that I came across, even if we look at studies that are really looking at CT and MRI to really judge muscle mass losses, not just lean body mass losses. And I guess the other caveat is just like you mentioned, exercise. From all of the studies that I've read looking at weight loss with exercise versus without, even endurance training, but especially probably resistance training would be ideal, seriously preserves or mitigates those the lean body mass and fat mass losses. And I've only seen one study so far looking at GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs paired with exercise, and it was actually a weight loss maintenance study. Maybe you're familiar with it. And to me, I mean, well, it's not the ideal study design. I think it was something like 12 weeks or 16 weeks they were on, or maybe it was actually 8 weeks on a very low calorie diet, maybe like 1,000 calories a day. I could be off with that, but pretty much they had an active weight loss phase to start out. And then they had a weight loss maintenance phase. They had one group, like the control, that didn't really get much guidance, I think. They had an exercise only group, a liraglutide group. So for anyone listening, liraglutide is kind of an older generation of the GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs. I think maybe right before semaglutide. I could be off there, but not as powerful in terms of how much weight loss it induces compared to semaglutide. And then I think the most recent one, or one of the newer ones, is like tirzepatide, which is at least even greater weight loss. But yeah, they had control group, exercise plus liraglutide, and liraglutide only. And over the course of, I don't know what it was, maybe 8 weeks or something, 12 weeks of maintenance, the control group gained back fat mass and I think muscle mass. The exercise group increased their weight and gained a little bit of lean body mass, I think it was. I shouldn't say muscle mass. And the, I don't remember exactly the outcome, but the liraglutide only group didn't see a ton of loss in muscle mass or again, lean body mass or fat mass. And the liraglutide plus exercise group, I think, saw no differences in lean body mass, but increased or continued fat mass losses. Anyways, that's like the best evidence I've seen so far, looking at whether you combine exercise with these GLP-1 drugs. And it seems like a reasonably positive outcome if you're thinking about whether or not these drugs independently act on muscle mass. But yeah, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on any of that.
Well, I really like your point about distinguishing between lean mass and muscle mass. It's true that if you're going to be losing weight in general, a significant portion of that comes down to the loss of water weight, especially early on, right? The first, I don't know, 3 to 7 days, you're going to, even in that muscle mass, you're going to lose quite a large amount of glycogen, plus your liver is going to lose quite a lot of glycogen, which I think the ratio is something like 3 grams of water for every 1 gram of glycogen. And I think we store, don't quote me on exactly this amount, it's been years since I've looked at the numbers, but something like 450 grams, 500 grams of glycogen. So it's a good amount of water weight that a person loses when they're burning through their glycogen levels. So yeah, that's a great point. As for the exercise component, yeah, I think that in general, I mean, just like interventions in general should try to have some sort of exercise component because it has just such profound positive effects across all bodily systems. But when we're talking about fat loss, it does tend to lead to a proportional proportional shift of greater fat loss as opposed to, we'll say, lean mass loss, which can happen if you're not exercising, to one of your earliest points. If you're not exercising and you lose significant weight loss, especially if you're doing a significant calorie restriction, like you were saying, 1,000 calories, roughly in that realm, it's usually like 800, 1,000 calories in those kinds of studies. You can see pretty dramatic weight loss, but the biggest problem is sustaining that weight loss long term, which is one of the biggest problems that people have. And I think that a lot of that goes down to the whole dieting culture and yo-yoing back and forth. And we jump on these calorie restrictive diets, we lose a bunch of weight, and then we just go back to our usual methods. And I think one of the benefits of some drug like this, which I'm still cautiously optimistic, because I don't know if down the road we're going to end up discovering something really sinister about this, but just by the mechanism and what research I've read so far, it does seem to be pretty positive. One of the great benefits of this kind of thing is that as long as a person continues to take it, and it was seen to be effective initially, that it helps curb some of that willpower aspect that a lot of people strive for, of like, I'm just going to lose 30 pounds. And sometimes they achieve it, but then they immediately start regaining it because they think, I've reached my goal. I can stop now. And this kind of implementation, this kind of intervention with liraglutide, tirzepatide, semaglutide, all that stuff, they allow a person to reach their goal and potentially maintain at least aspects of their goal, because their physiology doesn't immediately just bite them straight in the ass and just start fighting them all the way back up to where they used to be. And that actually leads pretty well. I don't know if you've read any of the literature on like set point theory and settling point theory and all that stuff, but a lot of that stuff can be extremely discouraging, especially, I guess, set point theory can be pretty discouraging for a lot of people. So it's I think overall, just to put it in a word, it's a net positive.
Yeah. A couple other interesting things I was thinking about is, first, I could be wrong, but I think the weight loss aspect of these GLP-1 drugs was discovered kind of accidentally, in that they were first used for type 2 diabetes. Is that how you understand it too?
Yeah, that's right.
Cool. And I think that's interesting because metformin, another drug originally used for type 2 diabetes, or still used for type 2 diabetes, had there was kind of the discovery that maybe it was increasing lifespan, right? I think it was like some observational research looking at type 2 diabetics versus non-diabetics, and the type 2 diabetics were living longer, which is what you wouldn't expect, because typically they would be less kind of metabolically fit individuals, but they were taking metformin. And I think since then there's kind of some controversy over to what degree metformin is could be like a kind of longevity drug, and that's like a whole kind of other rabbit hole that I'm definitely not qualified enough to be talking about. But anyway, I thought it was interesting that another drug for type 2 diabetes that became really popular also had this kind of other effect that we discovered just coincidentally along the way. And another really cool thing that I didn't know about these GLP-1 drugs until listening to you talk about them is that their activity or effect on the pancreas to secrete insulin is dependent on whether or not glucose levels are just elevated, or whether they're elevated or not. So it's not like the pancreas just secretes insulin upon these GLP-1 molecules binding to them. It's only if they bind in the context of elevated blood sugar, which I think is like really cool. Maybe that's just like for nerds like us to geek out to, but that was like really cool to learn about.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. That was news to me too when I was reading through the literature. There's a lot of feedback mechanisms in our physiology just to make sure that we don't completely screw things up. So, and like I said, we produce GLP-1, so our production of GLP-1 needs to be modulated in some way. And usually how that works is you have GLP-1, they'll bind to different receptors. Let's say on the pancreas, it'll bind to its specific receptor to then lead to this release of insulin. But it's not like it binds to the receptor and then there's just a straight shot to the insulin and then it just releases it. There's all kinds of different proteins that have to interact with one another and tag each other, and all these different factors that get involved. And it's entirely possible, and there's definitely mechanisms like that, where you can go through halfway this cascade. Let's say the GLP-1 binds to the receptor. It leads to what's known as a conformational change. So the receptor will actually change its shape slightly. And then the interior section, because the receptor is essentially embedded into, it has an exterior portion of the receptor on the cell membrane. Then it has a section that's found inside of the actual cell membrane, the actual fatty lipid layer, and then it has a section that comes out the inside that's actually inside the cell, and that it's that internal section that will shift its shape, which will then attract different proteins. What I mean by attract, I mean that chemically. I mean that like bonding and things like that. It's not like they're like wooing other proteins or anything like that. It's just they change the shape, which allows for proteins to interact with that, with the internal section of that receptor. And then those proteins will then interact with other proteins, essentially creating a cascade. But if halfway through that cascade, function hasn't been fulfilled, and in this case, glucose isn't present inside the cell in a high concentration, then the whole system will just shut off again. So you don't get the continuation of that signaling cascade, and the insulin will then remain inside the pancreas. And so I don't know the exact mechanism, like the exact proteins that are involved in that for GLP-1, but I would imagine it's some sort of similar system. Like and I do know that for when we consume carbohydrates and we have this rise in blood sugar, that blood sugar, some of that gets consumed by the pancreas, and the pancreas senses that there's this elevation in blood sugar, which changes the ATP concentration, the adenosine triphosphate, or the cellular energy concentration inside the pancreatic cells. And that's what leads to this, there's a bunch of sequential reactions, but ultimately it leads to the release of insulin. So it's entirely possible that GLP-1 has to bind. You have this cascade that begins. You have to have glucose that enters the cell at the exact same time, which leads to its own cascade, and then they merge together at a certain point. And if that merging doesn't happen, then the continuation of that cascade no longer happens. So that would be my guess. But to your point, yes, it's fascinating. It's really incredible stuff.
Yeah, that's cool. You mentioned something about willpower and dieting. What's your take on the genetic role that, or the role that genetics plays in terms of kind of successful body weight or body weight management? In that, like, I've heard some people talk about how some people might just have, it's like they attribute it to willpower, that some people are just able to make different decisions than others. Whereas other people have talked about how maybe the inclination some people have to fight, for example, to avoid like taking that extra bowl of ice cream or whatever, might be of different magnitude than somebody else. And that genetics may be playing a role there in terms of like the psychology or the neural aspect of it all, or just genetics in general. What are your thoughts of kind of what role that plays in terms of where people's body weight kind of pans out?
Yeah, I think it's fundamental. I think it's a massive aspect. It's probably the majority of our health and how we respond to things and whatnot. But that doesn't mean that we can't change them. Think of genetics as like a hardwiring, but your epigenetics, so the tags and whatnot of which genes. I guess I'll walk it through for anybody that's listening. You have genes, right? And I explained this before, GLP-1, you have genes that encode the information for the actual production of the proteins. But we've discovered that just because you have the genes, everybody has the same genes. But just because you have the genes doesn't mean that that gene is going to be expressed or read or produced into a protein. Those are all three the same thing. Produced into a protein at the same rate or the same amount. Every single individual is very different in how they express these different proteins. So imagine if you have, let's just take one of the hunger hormones like ghrelin or something along those lines. If you're one of those people that just has really high expression of this ghrelin, then it's entirely possible that you may have completely different behavior. And the only reason why is not because you have more of this gene, but it's because you have different tags, these different epigenetic tags, which are kind of like the soft programming on top of the gene. If you have certain tags on the very same gene, you can have less expression of a particular protein, a particular hormone, or you can have more expression of a particular protein or hormone. And this changes nonstop throughout the day. You have these tags that get placed and taken off and placed and taken off. It's just, and you have different types of tags, acetylation tags, methylation tags, sumoylation. Like there's all kinds of stuff that people just don't even begin to well, it's it's a vast ocean of information that I think a lot of people don't understand because they're just not in the field. So it's certainly understandable. But to your overall point, yeah, I think that genetics plays a major factor. For some people, it makes it extremely difficult to overcome. For the vast majority of people, even though we have a lot of differences in the way that the genes are expressed, there is always hope to be able to overcome or change our own epigenetic patterns, because we can do that. We can't necessarily take out the genes and replace it with a new gene, but we can change the epigenetic patterns. So our behavior and our thought processes and the way that we go about our lives definitely in our environment, makes a big difference on which genes are expressed and how we go about our day and how we feel and things of that nature. But no doubt genes as a whole make a big difference.
Yeah, to your first point about them, you thinking that there may be genetics plays maybe the biggest role in terms of health outcomes. The line that came to mind for me was one from Peter Attia, where he says, I think in some interviews people will ask him like, okay, so how do I live longer? And one of the first, or maybe the first thing he'll say is pick the right parents first, just to get the right genetic influence there. But a couple of interesting studies I read recently just to kind of emphasize that there are kind of some human trials showing that genetics plays a role. These are studies from like 1994-ish. There are two things, typically maybe older studies might get a bad rap. One, because like things have evolved and we have much cooler techniques and we can see into the cell way more in depth. But these studies were cool for two reasons. In general, older studies, after you're reading research for like a couple of hours, are nice because they're usually much shorter, especially the method sections. Like if you're reading through them, it's nice to pull up a PDF and for it to be like 6 pages or like 9 pages instead of like 15. But the other reason that I think they're really cool is this one, or these this pair by, I think it was Bouchard and colleagues, is that you don't really see studies the way they did them, in that they took, I think it was a small sample size, maybe like 20 subjects, and they kept them in a lab or like a laboratory type setting for like 100 days. And they observed everything they were doing for 24 hours. And in one study, they took identical twins, pairs, I think it was like 7 pairs of identical twins or something. In one study, they used like indirect calorimetry to pretty much guess what their baseline metabolic rate would be. And they did, I think, like underbody weighing to look at their body composition. And they also had a run-in period where they were tracking everything they were eating and weighing them to see, again, kind of estimate how much they would have to eat to just be at maintenance for their body weight not to change. And over something like 100 days, they took whatever the maintenance calories were for each of these subjects, and they overfed them exactly the same amount. It was like something like 1,000 calories. And they had 2 researchers, not one, 2 researchers sit with them for every meal and make sure they measured out everything they were eating. So it was really, really precise. Again, like you really don't see a protocol like this today, probably because people would not put up with this anymore. I don't know what they were giving them back then for a reward. But you see in that study, there were, the identical twins were more likely to have similar outcomes. There were a broad range, or there was a broad range of the weight gain across the subjects. Everybody gained weight, but some people gained like 2 pounds, some people gained like 15 pounds. And so there's a huge genetic component because the twins who had the same exact genes were more likely to have similar outcomes. But the interesting thing is that they didn't have exactly the same outcome. So maybe it was like 6 pounds gained versus 7 pounds gained or 8 pounds gained. And so genetics clearly played a role, but not the entire role. And interestingly, they had a similar study where instead of overfeeding them, they did kind of the same exact design, except they had the subjects consume their maintenance calories across the whole study, and they had them exercise on like a bicycle for an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening, which was supposed to come out to like 1,000 calories burned per day based on how much their like power output on the cycling machine. But again, you see pretty significant differences across the individuals in terms of the weight lost. Again, like pretty much everyone lost weight, but some people are losing like 15, 20 pounds. Some people are losing like 5 or 7 pounds. And similarly, again, the identical twins tended to have similar outcomes. So like when they graphed it, the line of fit was pretty consistent. All the different points were pretty tight around the line of fit. But again, they didn't have exactly the same outcomes. Which to me suggested that genetics didn't play an entire role. And they kind of went into some cool explanations for why different people might have had different outcomes. Largely, for the overfeeding study, I think it had to do with like NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is kind of like what I'm doing, like moving my hands around and stuff. Because some people are just more prone to do that than others. And during weight loss, some people will stop doing that entirely, just naturally or subconsciously to like prevent weight loss. But anyway, yeah, that was just like just reminded me a couple of interesting studies I read on the topic recently, and I don't know, maybe I'll send them to you after. But those seeing those methods and like the protocols I feel like they took somebody complaining on social media today about them not having enough control and having it not be like realistic, or having them not know exactly how much everyone was consuming because of food frequency questionnaires. And they like went back in time and like made the perfect study design.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely, those studies are fascinating. Bouchard he's the one who wrote the sports gene. If I could be off on that, but I think that's right. So I don't remember his first name, but it's a book talking about a lot of how genetics play a factor in sports performance, and I think some other aspects as well. But yeah, I mean, those studies are fascinating. Yeah, I'd love if you can send them to me. I'd love to see them.
Yeah, for sure. Tell me about GlyNAC, which I've seen you put some content about. I'm familiar with glycine just from being an amino acid, not much on how its effects on our health. For N-acetylcysteine, I'm decently familiar with because maybe a couple of years ago when I was still in college, I went on this kind of deep dive into research on hangover prevention. And one of the things that popped up that was actually legitimate, or seemed to have at least some legitimate backing, was cysteine supplementation. There was one study in particular that used L-cysteine instead of N-acetylcysteine. But as you could probably guess, it's just pretty much the idea was that it would raise glutathione levels and combat the inflammation that may be causing the hangovers. But anyway, what have you learned about GlyNAC, and what kind of has you interested in that piece of the world?
Well, yeah, I did some analyses on a few of the GlyNAC studies. There may be more now, but this was, I guess, a year and a half ago now. I looked at all the GlyNAC studies, not specifically the NAC studies, so not the N-acetylcysteine alone or the glycine alone, but specifically the combination of the two. And there's this group out of University of Baylor Medicine that decided to combine both glycine and N-acetylcysteine to make GlyNAC, and it's not like a special formulation. It's literally just glycine and then also consume N-acetylcysteine, because sometimes people get that confused. They think it's like some special molecule. It's not. Then from there, they gave it to participants that were, I believe, in their 70s, and they weren't overly unhealthy or anything like that, but they were still given, obviously relatively old, so in their 70s. And they supplemented for at least 16 weeks. It might be more than that. It might be like 24 weeks or something along those lines. And they took a number of measurements, maybe every 8 weeks or so. And they did a slew of different measurements, like from insulin resistance to basic ones like cholesterol, blood pressure, that kind of stuff. They also looked at DNA damage. So there's different markers that you can look at in the blood for DNA damage. And they ultimately ended up discovering in a pilot study, so just a study of, just a few participants, GlyNAC improved a whole host of different metrics. And it wasn't like it just improved it a little bit. Some of them it improved just a little bit. I think like blood pressure, it maybe just improved it a few points. But looking at like insulin resistance after 16 weeks, 24 weeks, is something like, I don't know, 60% reduction in insulin resistance, which are like massive effect sizes. I mean, it's really huge. So then they repeated the experiment repeated the study with more participants, including younger individuals as well. But the younger individuals were just used as a control group. So they weren't around to continue GlyNAC supplementation for the full 24 weeks or however long it was. What they did is they wanted to compare, well, if we take metrics from really young individuals in their 20s and compare that against these 70-year-olds after they've been taking GlyNAC, are they comparable? And for certain metrics, they were comparable, actually, which is just like, I mean, it's like mind-blowing to have metrics that are similar. You're going back 50 years in time in terms of the overall effect. Now, to be clear, the way I think about this is that in this specific point in time, there is a similarity in the overall health of these individuals. That doesn't mean that these people are going back in time and now they look 20 years old or anything like that. I wish it were that way, but the thing is that time and aging is an accrual process. A lot of the things that we do to ourselves as we age, they just accrue over time, and they're not things that we can just, at least currently, they're not things that we can just take a supplement and then suddenly we'll just reverse back to the same stem cells, the same muscle mass, the same all that stuff. It's not like all that stuff just suddenly returns. But if you can at least arrest or very much slow the rate of aging, that's something that's very attractive. And I do think that eventually we will be able to start replacing certain old defunct systems like stem cells, like what are they, senescent cells, like being able to remove senescent cells and stuff like that. If that's ultimately going to lead to like the forever life or anything, I don't think we're going to get to that point. But can we potentially get to a point where you can lead a super youthful life and then just drop off a cliff and just die? I think that's possible. But GlyNAC, the supplementation was one of those supplements that was just genuinely really, really impressive. The animal studies were impressive. The human trials were impressive. And the only reservation that I have about it is that it's only one study, or it's two studies in humans, but it's out of one group. And not that I don't trust that scientific group or anything like that, but I always like to see repeatability. So I'd love to see just one more scientific group come out with a similar study where they repeat the results and show, yes, there are these benefits. Now, to counteract that, I will say that there are a few NAC studies, so just looking at NAC, and those do show some positive effects as well, and those are from different groups. So it's not like this is just like out of thin air that we're getting these results. So it's exciting, but I'm being, again, cautiously optimistic about it.
Gotcha. Cool. You going on with a little bit more about kind of longevity and maybe lifespan, health span stuff. Earlier, you briefly touched on how much exercise has to offer, and I went off on a little tangent talking about how I think exercise has come into the spotlight a lot more lately in terms of not just looking better or performing better, but actually living better and improving health outcomes. What do you have to say about that? I know since you did your master's in exercise physiology, like someone comes to you and is looking for information on, how to improve their health and stuff, what would you tell them about exercise, in particular resistance training? Should they be doing endurance training, some type of combination? Where would you have them start? Or I guess what are some of the benefits that kind of get you pumped up about exercise?
You could talk about that for hours, as I'm sure you know. Yeah, the benefits of exercise are incalculable. It's basically whatever supplement you're taking, whatever nutrition plan you're on, everything can be. It's like all the effects that you see from any supplement routine or whatever it might be can be. You can get every effect from every supplement by just exercising, and more, and certainly much more, I would say. Which just makes exercise this real elixir of life. It's not necessarily, again, it's not going to reverse aging to the point where you're just going to end up looking like a 20-year-old, but it does have tremendous anti-aging effects from a health span perspective, meaning that, so just to define this, you've got lifespan, which is just the overall amount of time that you live. And then you have health span, which is the quality of that time. So how much can you actually do? And from a health span perspective, exercise is probably beat by nothing out there. And I don't know if it ever will be, mainly because even if you were to target any single aspect, let's say bone health or muscle health or cardiovascular health or whatever it might be, exercise is affecting all of them maximally. And even if you were to find an intervention that could affect one of them, the odds that it's affecting it maximally, and on top of that it's also affecting all these other systems, and on top of that you're basically going to have no side effects from it, that's a miracle. I mean, it's genuinely a miracle. So the side effect is that it takes a lot of work. You have to work at it. You have to actually do it. But the ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine, and other organizations that are like the main organizations for exercise intervention and whatnot, they've done a ton of studies to figure out what's kind of the minimum threshold that you can get a tremendous amount of benefit with the lowest amount of input from the person. And it's as low as 10 minutes. So if you just exercise for 10 minutes a day, that would be enough to get like 80% of the benefits of exercise, which is, I mean, that's such a great risk benefit that's there from that. Of course, if you do more, you'll get more and more benefit up until a point. There's eventually a plateau point, and there's a curve that starts to go down depending on which bodily system you're talking about. So if you were to exercise 7 days a week, maybe twice a day, your glycogen stores would probably be completely bankrupt. But secondly, on top of that, you probably have problems like you have different bone issues, muscle disorders, tendinosis, like things like that that are just overuse disorders. And this happens with like triathletes, especially or like women that can have amenorrhea, so loss of menstrual cycle. So there's certainly negatives, but that's really if you're just overdoing it. But if somebody were to approach me and say, hey, I want to get started, I would tell them, look, at the bare minimum, just do 10 minutes every other day. Just do some compound exercises. So I'm talking like just do like 1 to 3 sets of squats, whatever you can manage. Do some push-ups, whatever you can manage. You can do like assisted versions of these if you're not at that point, which is perfectly understandable. You should have seen me when I first started. I was horrible. And then the other thing I would do is something like a pulling exercise of some sort. And then, aerobic exercise, doing some sort of endurance exercise, even again, if that's 5 minutes, and slowly building your way up over time until eventually you get to maybe 3 times a week, 30 minutes a day. And that'll get you the majority of the benefits. If you want to go beyond that, you'll certainly get more benefit, but I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, touching on what you talked about in terms of the kind of minimum effective dose needed to get the benefits. Are you familiar with Dr. Pack?
I've heard that name, but no.
So or what about, have you heard of Milo Wolf? Maybe.
Again, I've heard that name, but no.
So they're both sports science PhDs or something to do with like exercise science, I think. They're good friends with like Dr. Mike Israetel. I've seen them over there on his channel a lot, and I think that's where I first found them. And I talked to both of them. Interestingly, when Milo came on, he had just finished his PhD defense as well.
Cool.
One thing both of them have talked about, but what was actually Dr. Pack's PhD thesis, I think, was the minimum effective dose to increase strength. So he did some really interesting studies looking at powerlifters, but looking at the literature he went through, I think even depending on which study you look at, you could argue like as little as just like 2 sets per week in terms of strength gives benefit. And I think when it comes to muscle hypertrophy, muscle growth, if you look, there was a meta-analysis done kind of a while ago that showed I think it was like 9 to 10 sets had the greatest muscle hypertrophy. And then the next kind of category was whatever is next, like 6 to 8 sets or something. And then the last one was 5 or less sets. And you see that the more sets you're doing per week, the more muscle hypertrophy you're getting, at least within up to 10 sets at this point. I think it was like 2012, 2014, something like that. And there's been kind of more research coming out in terms of training volume and muscle hypertrophy that I guess there's some controversy around, which we won't get into. But my point is, for muscle hypertrophy, as little as like 4 or 5 sets too shows muscle growth, not even just maintenance of the muscle growth and strength that you've already obtained, which is even less. But just to add to your point, that's definitely something I didn't realize, and I think most people would overestimate, is how little you actually have to do to make gains, not only in terms of your progress in the gym, but the health benefits that come with them, presumably. And I think that's important because some people who don't exercise or don't like to exercise might look and say, oh, well, if I'm not putting in like 3 hours a day, 3 times per week, 5 times per week, I'm not going to get any benefits. So I'm just going to go with nothing at all instead. And realizing that they're really low-hanging fruit to grab, like you emphasized, has been kind of an eye-opener for me from the perspective of people who don't really like to exercise, but would still be interested in the health benefits if they knew how little they actually had to do. So it seems like maybe you come, like you described yourself as like a bigger guy, obviously in terms of height, but also maybe in terms of your physique. It seems like maybe you do a lot of lifting weights, but you also talked about some endurance training. What's your thought on the idea that just lifting weights and then getting your steps in will be enough, and that you don't need to add endurance training on top of that? Maybe looking for not necessarily optimal outcomes, but like you described, how going beyond the minimum that you just discussed or described would lead to greater benefits. Do you think someone who's really looking to kind of push the limits of what exercise has to offer, do you think that they really need to be adding in cardio, or what do you think about just hitting enough steps alongside resistance training?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll preface this by saying I haven't looked at the literature in this regard, so just be aware of that. But I'll give you my impressions. I definitely think that doing dedicated endurance training is going to have a benefit to your overall health, but also certainly your overall performance, including with resistance training. I think there is some literature looking at if you do endurance training, it will help with your lifting weights as well, and just general resistance training. If you want to be overall well-rounded, I do think that there's added benefit to doing dedicated endurance training, especially different intensities and different durations that you may not get from step counting or from just getting a certain number of steps. And the reason for that is because VO2 can be changed to a degree, but the only way that VO2 can be changed is if your physiology is changing. And if you're not pushing your physiology to change, just like in resistance training, then let's say with resistance training, you're lifting weights, it's short burst activity, which leads to mass stimulation of the muscle cells, which ultimately leads them to grow. And there's a bunch of mechanisms involved in that, but I won't go into it for the time being. But when you're talking about like VO2, there's a bunch of different systems that have to coordinate and work extremely well. So obviously your lungs, obviously your blood system, obviously all these different, your red blood cells have to be able to carry oxygen. You have to have more red blood cells, things like that. And a lot of that is driven by like hormones like EPO, which a lot of people have heard about from Lance Armstrong, for example, doping scandal and all that. But we produce EPO ourselves. And the way that we do that is by having this exercise stimulus, specifically endurance exercise. And it has a direct effect on our red blood cells. And you think of your lungs, they need to be revascularized. You need to add more vasculature to different sections of your body, if that's into the musculature itself, around your lungs. You're essentially, I mean, your body's an alive thing. It's constantly growing in different ways that we don't think of. We just look at muscle, we say, ooh, big muscle. But like in truth, there's a ton of different things that are happening around that musculature that allow it to function even more optimally. And I think that with endurance training, you are maximizing that. You're forcing your physiology to change, to grow more blood vessels, to have better oxygen exchange and CO2 exchange at the alveoli. Like there's a lot of these little micro interactions that if you can maximize those on a grand scale for your entire body, then it's going to make a big difference. Your VO2 is going to increase and your overall health is going to increase. Your performance is going to increase. So yeah, I do think that implementing specifically endurance exercise and trying to get better at it is a great way to go. It's probably necessary. Do I personally do that? No, because I'm too, well, I don't want to say I'm too busy. I'm legitimately just too lazy. So that's my excuse. But so if anybody wants to use my excuse, please feel free. But I'm just telling you the science.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you for the transparency.
You're welcome.
Going along with endurance training, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up mitochondria at least once, since I was looking through some of your papers before we kicked off here, or some of the papers you have been co-author on looking at mitochondria. Talk to me about mitochondria, maybe from like just the basic level of mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, up to through like maybe some of the cool stuff.
Wow.
Just because everybody is, talks about mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell. And I feel like this is one of those words like inflammation or like metabolism that just get thrown around and people don't actually understand what's going on. And I certainly am as guilty of this as anybody else. So, ideally, anyone listening to this who isn't already more knowledgeable than just knowing the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell will be able to leave and explain maybe something about the mitochondria beyond just that, tidbit of information.
Yeah, you're teaching me, Aiden. I had no idea it was the powerhouse of the cell.
Right. I coined that one myself, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive. Yeah, the first thing that jumps to people's minds is, of course, what's been resonating across biology classrooms for decades, which is, as you pointed out, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, which is true. It's not some grand conspiracy. It's definitely true. But mitochondria are these organelles, these systems with these factories, if you want to call them, that are inside your cells, not all your cells, but most of your cells. And they do a whole host of different things. They help regulate your immune system. They help fight against pathogens. So when your cells literally get invaded by a virus, mitochondria can help fight against those viruses. It can help against cancer. So it has a system called mitochondria-dependent apoptosis, which is a fancy term of saying that the mitochondria will allow the cell to die in a very particular way, which is beneficial to your health, because you want your cells to be able to essentially succumb or die if they need to. So mitochondria have a whole host of different benefits and functions within our cells. And they're certainly intimately related to metabolism. So we think of it as the powerhouse of the cell, and that's related to metabolism, but they are the site where we exclusively produce ATP, which I briefly mentioned earlier, which is the cellular currency, this adenosine triphosphate, ATP. That gets produced in the mitochondria, and that's because we convert fats. So the lipids, the fats that you consume and the foods that you consume, or the fats that are liberated from your fat cells, those enter into another cell, like a muscle cell, and then those fats get directed towards mitochondria. And mitochondria will go through a bunch of enzymatic processes called beta oxidation, and then allow for those fats to be used for the generation of ATP, which then your cell uses for any number of different functions. So there's a ton of different ways that mitochondria play a role. That said, let me just quick caveat this as well. I studied mitochondria for 10 years from undergrad, master's, and my PhD. And the one thing that's become really clear to me is that people are really obsessed with mitochondrial function and mitochondrial dysfunction. They think that if they heal mitochondrial dysfunction, that suddenly they're going to be able to heal any number of different disease states. And there's this real obsession. But what's funny is that back in the 90s, all the researchers were obsessed with the endoplasmic reticulum, which is another section of your cell. So it seems like we're just moving from one thing to another thing to another thing. It's like every few decades we just move. Oh, now it's this thing. So as a person who studied mitochondria, and I would love to be like, oh yeah, my thing that I'm studying is the thing. I have strong doubts that it's actually going to be the panacea that's often portrayed at. But currently, it seems to be a hot topic.
That's cool to hear you talk about, because I think, and I may have even heard you say this in one of the videos I was listening to, that when people get really deep into research the way you just described, how you've been looking at mitochondria for 10 years, suddenly it's like if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything becomes a nail.
Yeah, that's good.
And so
yeah, exactly.
like one thing, like lately, the stuff about the gut microbiome, it has been going crazy, and it seems like there's some cool stuff to be learned there. But interestingly, when I've listened to anyone who seems to be like a PhD, who's doing research in the gut microbiome, or who to some degree is an expert on the gut microbiome, talking on podcasts or things, they seem to be much less using much less hyperbole than maybe like more influencer type people who are saying like, the gut is the key to everything and all these things. And again, not that the gut doesn't have really cool influences on different parts of the body, but I guess digressing back to my point I was making, it's cool for you to be able to acknowledge, like, one, you're biased towards thinking mitochondria might be the hammer for the nail that is everything wrong with the human body. Was I had one more thing? Oh yeah. So I want to be respectful of your time, and I have just one more thing I wanted to ask you, which I think it was when I was listening to one of your first podcasts. For anyone listening who isn't familiar, you have had a couple of guests on, but your podcasts are mostly you just talking kind of almost conversationally, for several hours, with less scripted things, like, maybe some of your tighter videos that you make. You were talking about like explaining mechanisms and kind of your reason for starting the podcast and putting out your content, like sharing enthusiasm about science. And you went all the way talking about when you were back in college, going back and forth every weekend to make videos and stuff. And so I'm just curious what advice you would give to somebody who is maybe starting out looking at research, who hasn't looked at research before, who wants to get into kind of reading and interpreting scientific research. Any kind of thoughts or advice in hindsight that after you've come all this way from going from undergrad to your master's to all this research in between or throughout and your PhD. And then also, I guess, any thoughts or advice you have on someone who maybe isn't even looking to get super deep into reading the research, but being able to navigate social media where you have all different kinds of, a whole mix of really great content that's really scientific and really research based to maybe the other end of the spectrum and everything in between.
Yeah, those are two very loaded questions, but excellent.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, excellent questions. The first one related to, let's say somebody wanted to actually I was reached out to maybe a month or two ago from somebody that was interested in getting into research, and they asked me a very similar question. And the best way to go about it, let's say you wanted to get into research and understanding how to read research and just get into that field in general, is one, you definitely have to have a formal education in the area. But how do you get to that point? Well, you can. So what I did is during undergrad, again, initially I'd gotten my degree in psychology. So when I went back to school, I had basically no hard science. I had no biology, no chemistry, all that stuff. So, but I knew that I needed experience. So aside from just taking courses, which was one way to go, and I did things in parallel. The other thing that I did was I just contacted a bunch of researchers and just said, "Hey, I'll work for you for free," and that works. That'll definitely work. There's a lot of researchers that are looking for help, especially if it's for free. There's definitely an upfront cost for them because it can be pretty intense, just like learning about all these different things, and it's pretty intimidating. But once you get used to it, you develop a little bit more trust in yourself, and they have a lot more trust in you, and eventually you'll get to a point where you can suggest experiments and you can do your own experiments and stuff like that, especially if it's a really well-funded lab, and you have a good researcher that you're working with. They will, they'll there is a chance, depending on the temperament of the researcher, there's a chance that you'll be able to just say, "Hey, I want to try this thing," and they'll just be like, "Okay, go do it." And it could cost a good amount of money, but they'll pay for it just because they want to see what happens, and it obviously has to be somewhat related to the topic that this researcher has been studying. So step one, pick something you want to learn more about. Let's say exercise physiology. Let's say if that's nutrition. Let's say if that's cancer research. It doesn't matter, just pick something. Then go to your nearest university's website and look up cancer research or, exercise physiology department, whatever it is. Look up there's going to be a list of researchers. Click on each one of them, figure out, maybe write down like 3 of their names, their email addresses, and then just email them and just politely say, "Hey, I don't have a background in this. I've been dying to learn more about research. I would love to learn from you as kind of an apprentice. And I can guarantee you at least 2 of them, but for sure one of them will respond back, and you'll go there. They'll interview you, not like a really formal interview. They'll just talk to you. They'll probably show you the lab. This is what it's like, and then they'll kind of tell you, they'll tell you what they're working on and where you might be able to help. And you may not be able to help much at the beginning, but within about 3 months you'll be able to help a lot more. So I think that's certainly a worthy investment. So that's the answer number one. I would definitely go that route. It's going to save you money, and it's going to save you a lot of headache, because if you start going into school and then you realize, oh snap, this research thing is not for me, you just spent a lot of money for something that you shouldn't have been spending any money on. So so that's number one. Number two, how do people navigate social media landscape? I think so. My answer is going to be a bit brutish. It's going to be a little bit simple, and it's not going to be nuanced, which I try to be as nuanced as I possibly can. But when you're navigating social media, I think people just don't have the bandwidth to sit there and be like, let me consider this 6 point, spreadsheet of like how to analyze if this is legitimate or not, which I certainly empathize with. So what I would say is it's like hacking at a big slab of meat. It's very rudimentary, but I would say, are they citing their sources? Do they? And when I say citing their sources, studies, has to be studies or established institutions. I know that some people don't have much trust for established institutions like the CDC and WHO and whatnot, but at the very least, the vast majority of that information has been vetted by many, many, many researchers, and they're all kind of together. But let's say you didn't want to listen to that. You could go to any sort of there's these like compendiums of researchers where they all get together on a yearly basis and essentially just discuss all the literature in their field, and then they come out with a statement saying, hey, we've discussed this. This is, and we're talking literally like 100 researchers have come together to come to this conclusion, and this is what we think currently. So you could go to some of these. You don't have to physically go, but you can go to like their websites. There's all for cardiology. There's cancer ones. There's just look for like compendiums of researchers. But so studies for one, and two, kind of these established organizations. That would be two of the big ones. Then when it comes to the research, sometimes you'll have some social media influencers that will cite studies that have almost nothing to do, or they're just very mechanistic, going back to the very beginning of our conversation. And in that scenario, I would literally just ignore everything mechanism related. Just chuck it. Just don't even consider. If you see a citation and it's this mechanism in cells or in animals or whatever, just to be careful. I understand that there may be some truth to what that study says, but as a person who doesn't have any experience with it and a person who has limited bandwidth to sit there and investigate all this stuff, just chuck it. just don't even worry about it. If the study is in humans, then it's, now we're talking a little bit more nuance, and now we're getting into that gray zone. So that's perfectly fair. And if you want to maybe then engage, and then what I would say after that, after okay, this person has references, there are studies in humans, then the next step is see what other doctors and other health professionals and whatnot say on the topic, and make sure that they're referencing things as well. Because if it's and if they're screaming at the screen, and telling you, oh my God, watch out for this and watch out for that, chuck them too, because it gets crazy out there. So I'd say just that kind of two-step process. Look for references. It should be in humans. And then try to look for kind of the consensus. Because again, and it's always tough because in my head, I'm thinking, I engage with a lot of people that are just like, well, the consensus is wrong. It's a conspiracy and all this stuff. And I don't want to dismiss these people, but there's so much more behind the scenes than they're aware of. And to get hundreds of researchers on board to agree with with general statements is not something that's just like prone to conspiracy. It's like, you should meet these researchers. They, you go talk to them and they're just really into what they study. They will argue with one another till they're blue in the face. They care about just doing things correctly. I'm not saying all of them, obviously, because we're talking about humans still, but yeah, it's just, so it's a rudimentary system, but that's the way I would approach it. I think that's probably the best way to. You'll probably miss some golden nuggets if you use this system. You probably will miss some people that are putting out good information. But, worst case scenario, you chuck one piece of information that they throw at you. If they keep producing good information, hopefully you'll run across their stuff again, and hopefully they'll have references, and then you'll be able to vet them a little bit more. So that's my take.
Yeah, that sounds like great advice. And coming full circle back to the mechanisms and maybe Lane Norton. I remember him saying kind of recently, like, you could find a mechanism for anything. Touching on what you were saying about throwing out kind of mechanism references if you're not like maybe well read in that area. And he talked about how there's a paper with a mechanism showing that potatoes in vitro or something having to do with like a molecule in potatoes, does this really great thing. And so you could extrapolate to say, oh, you should be eating French fries all the time or something like that.
Yeah.
But anyways, where can anyone listening find you, or where do you recommend they go to? Anything you have coming out moving forward that they can check out?
Just look up physionics. So it's just physio, like, physiotherapy, PHYSIO, and then NIC, which is NIC. Just jam it all together. Physio, NIC. And then you'll find me. I'm not concerned.
Is it bad that I'm just now realizing that your name, Nick, is in physionics and that wasn't just like a cool phrase?
Anyways, you shouldn't feel bad. I thought about it. It was kind of like a play on both, so it worked both ways. Gotcha.
Well, I had a ton of other things kind of lined up, or just notes for things to touch on. But maybe we'll talk about those on another day. Anyways, I really appreciate you coming on. All right, that wraps it up for my conversation with Dr. Nicolas Verhoeven. I'll leave some links below where you can check out some more of his content, and I'll also leave some links for some free weightlifting programs that you can check out if you're interested. With that, thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next time.